The story starts with our useless, pathetic protagonist, a young man called Nor, working hard to clean a small canal for an old lady. Some time later, he finished the job and the old hag was happy with the result because now the water could easily flow. She then signed a receipt to him and he left after thanking her. Afterward, we could see Nor carrying several packs at a construction site. Apparently, he did a pretty good job because while his hirer was signing him a receipt, he told him that thanks to him they would have no problem sticking to the construction schedule. However, at that moment, our jack-of-all-trades protagonist heard the voice of a woman crying for help. It seemed the voice came from inside a nearby cave, and Nor immediately ran toward there without hesitation. Once he got inside, he could see a group of knights who were fighting a giant minotaur. A huge flashback then began showing Nor when he was a kid. He was preparing some medicine for his mother who looked sick. He also had to feed the goats, take them to the hill, and take care of the place, since his father went to buy milk and the rest is history. His mother then warned him not to go too far away, to which he agreed. He also told her that he would get a wild rabbit, some nuts and seeds later. Right after, his mother took a rag and cleaned Nor's face while apologizing for being a useless waste of space, unable to do anything for him. In fact, she wanted him to live the life he wanted. That night, his mother died. He made a grave for her and kept taking care of the house and the farm until one day he found a book. At that moment, he recalled some story his worthless father had told him when he was younger. It told the adventures of an adventurer who once, with his friends, had slain a gigantic dragon. That adventurer had also learned magic spells from an old sorcerer and had broken a curse cast upon a forest. He even managed to obtain a cure-all elixir from the king of the dead. In the end, no matter the predicament, he would raise his sword and strike down evil for the sake of his friends. Of course, those tales excited him, and while he was reading the book, he also remembered his mother's words about living the life he wanted. The next day, he bid farewell to his parents' graves and said he would be leaving for the first time because he had decided to become an adventurer. After a long journey, he arrived at a city and he was astonished after seeing how big it was. Later, he entered it and was amazed by everything inside. After a while wandering the city, he finally arrived at the Adventurers Guild. But the man at the front desk quickly told him that that place was not for kids and asked him to get out. However, Nor didn't back down and said the guards at the gate had told him that he could become an adventurer if he went there. The man then replied that he was going to worry his parents, and our protagonist quickly clarified that his parents were dust. That made the man change his attitude and he finally asked for his name. He then told him that he should go to the training school for different classes. They had never had a kid like him before, though. The man then explained that hopefuls wanting to register with the Royal Capital's Adventurers Guild went to take lessons at the Royal Training School. They would basically get training for their job class. In short, if he wanted to be an adventurer, he should acquire some skills first, such as the art of the sword or magic. Nor got excited and decided to go there while thinking that a swordsman could kill a dragon as big as a mountain in a single swing. Some time later, he had joined a class and was training with the sword when one of his classmates managed to activate a fire skill. A few months later, other students had activated some skills too, and Nor kept training hard with the sword. Nevertheless, at that moment, his instructor told him to stop because there was no use. But Nor begged him to let him try a little longer. However, the instructor refused his request, saying going any further would be a waste of his time. After all, up to that moment, the only thing he had learned was parrying to evade an attack. He even recommended him to take another path. Perhaps his talent might be found in another training school. Nor was disappointed, but he didn't give up. Since becoming a swordsman was not possible, perhaps his path would be becoming a warrior. They fought with any weapon imaginable, risked their lives, and became a shield for their allies. Some time later, he was undergoing the tough training of the school, but after a few weeks, the instructor told him that although he acknowledged his efforts, What he had acquired was a slight improvement in his physical abilities. Moreover, if he forced himself to keep going, he would lose his life. His next attempt was trying to become a hunter, but the result was the same. The female instructor told him that he totally lacked the sense to handle any sort of delicate weaponry. Noor then decided to become a thief, but it was another failure. He couldn't dismantle the trap on a treasure chest, and he couldn't sense anyone's presence. The next stop? Becoming a magician. The result? Another failure. Well, it was not a complete failure since he could manage to create a tiny flame. It was very tiny, almost nothing. The instructor was even surprised because it was rare to see people as incapable of magic as he was. True, but at least that was better than his previous 2 attempts. Noor then decided to try his luck as a cleric, but although after some time he managed to heal light scratches, it was impressive that he could use low-level healing without being naturally blessed. After spending a full 3-month term practicing at every training school, Noor ended up returning to the Adventurers Guild without learning one decent skill. Unfortunately, the man in charge told him that he couldn't let him register as an adventurer like that. He then returned to his home and told his parents that he truly had no talent for anything. Well, at least he tried hard, let's give him that. However, even at that moment, he wasn't willing to give up. Instead, he decided he should take what he could and train much harder. Noor recalled that his swordsman instructor had told him that if he practiced one skill repeatedly, he might be able to master a new one. Thus, he built a training ground in his house and began to practice his parry skill like there was no tomorrow. 1 year later, he kept training and was capable of evading 10 swords in one breath. He hadn't gotten any new skills but was getting better. 3 years later, he was capable of evading 100 swords in one breath, but no news of a new skill. At that point, he had to admit that at that rate, becoming an adventurer was nothing but a pipe dream. His solution: he decided to train more intensely. He kept hitting the same wall and decided to break it with his head. 10 years later, Noor kept training while realizing he had spent 14 years doing that. At that moment, he could parry 1,000 wooden swords, but he hadn't gotten any new skill. The next day, he left his home again and decided to do one last try. He arrived at the Adventurers Guild, but the man from before was nowhere to be seen. The person in charge was a young lady who was awkward after reading Noor's set of skills. She even advised him to try going to the Royal Capital's class training school, but he told her that he had already been through all of them. In the end, he was about to be rejected again when the man from before finally appeared. It took him a little while, but he recognized our protagonist, who was a young adult at that point. Noor then told him what he had done during all those years and the results he had gotten. The man then explained that there were different ranks of adventurers, S rank being the highest and E rank being the lowest. To be recognized as an E rank, you gotta have more than one useful skill. Unfortunately, Noor didn't have that. However, when our pathetic protagonist was finally accepting he might have to give up his dream, the man told him that there was another way for him to be an adventurer. After all, there was actually something lower than the E rank, the outlying F rank, which was basically unheard of even to the people involved. Nevertheless, there were conditions even for that rank. He would be forbidden from taking any quests that involved killing anything or venturing out of the city to gather items. What he would be able to accept were miscellaneous tasks around the city, and that was about it. In the end, there were very few F-rank adventurers because no one was dumb enough to go to the trouble of becoming an adventurer just to do those requests. I think that man had just met someone dumb enough to accept that. Almost immediately, Noor asked him to register him for that. He didn't care about the conditions or if that job was mainly for beggars. He wanted to register as an official adventurer. The man sighed and yielded, so after a while he gave Noor his F-rank adventurer license. Noor didn't waste time, and after leaving the place he began to run errands around the city without neglecting his training. The good thing was that all those useless skills he had learned when training in those schools had become quite useful for doing those miscellaneous tasks around the city. In the end, his dream of becoming an adventurer and being of use to people had come true. He also was aware that anything beyond that might be asking for too much. The flashback finally ended, and we returned to the moment when Nor encountered the Minotaur. He had only seen those things in books, so he couldn't help but be astonished after realizing that the actual thing was really big. At that moment, the monster began to attack the group of knights in front of him, while they tried to protect a woman who was tied with some magic chains by becoming her shield. Unfortunately, the monster began to kill the knights one by one until only the woman was left. Nevertheless, when it was about to kill her, Nor managed to drag its attention to him, and after grabbing a sword from one of the corpses, he decided to face the monster. The battle then began, and our protagonist managed to parry all the monster's attacks. But the problem was that he had no way of counterattacking, and his sword was almost at its limit. At that moment, a strange ring activated, and the monster decided to kill the girl. Nor then remembered his father's words and decided to give his all to protect her. He parried the next attack and his sword broke, but he managed to parry the following attack with the hilt and was lucky enough to create a recoil so powerful that the Minotaur ended up beheading itself with its axe. The magic chains got broken, and the young woman thanked him for saving her, although he refused to give her his name since he was not anyone important. He then left, and after realizing that even a loose cow in the city that wasn't even a demon was such a menace, he decided that he still had more training to do. Lady Lindbergh, who had long silver hair, was showing some respect to the knights that had wasted their life protecting her when a blonde woman, who was also a knight, appeared beside her asking if she was hurt. Once the newcomer confirmed the other was okay, she kneeled and apologized, saying she should have gone with her. However, Lady replied that there was no point in having an escort for the trials for the fight for the throne. Moreover, she had been the one who insisted on that, which meant that the blonde woman, whose name was Inez, was not at fault. At that moment, another knight, Lord Darkin, appeared and told Lady Lindbergh that they should return to the castle at that moment since Lord Rain would like to speak with her. Later, a silver-haired young man told Lord Darkin that had spoken with Lynn and wondered if a Minotaur had been indeed summoned to the city. That was a demon who resided in the abyss, in the deepest layers of the dungeon. The knight confirmed that it had indeed been the case, and the young man concluded that the whole incident had been someone's doing. Darkin agreed and added that the source was thought to be a ring found on the corpse of a merchant at the scene. Furthermore, when Oaken did his research, he discovered that the magic stone in the ring was of a surprisingly high purity. It was something atypical that you wouldn't find on the market. Darkin then showed the ring to the young man. Afterward, the silver-haired guy said that Minotaurs were a threat level a demon, so wealthy folks couldn't just buy something that could trap a creature like that. Darkin then added that Oaken had said the crest left on the stone indicated the ring originated from the magic empire of Doritas. They both knew that Doritas had often provoked them, but at that moment he had become bolder. After all, he had attacked the princess by binding her with a barrier, so they decided to be more careful from that moment onwards, especially since the other part was not even trying to get rid of the evidence, which made the young man think that Doritas was waiting for their country to initiate a war. In the end, Doritas wanted their kingdom's resource, the relics of the Dungeon of the Lost. Afterward, they began discussing the matter of the man who had saved the princess. He had defeated the Minotaur in a matter of seconds with a single broadsword. Not to mention he had managed to lose the secret's core that were following his movements. Wow, it seems the man in charge of the Adventurers Guild should quit as a talent scout. Speaking of the devil, the man was drinking something at the Adventurers Guild when Nor arrived. He then informed him that the night before a demon had appeared near the entrance of the dungeon, and since he knew Nor was in that area, he had gotten worried. Our protagonist then recalled that the night before he was being followed around by a shady group of people, but he didn't reveal that and instead told the man that he had been so tired that had gone straight home. The man then told him he had been lucky because even in a rank like him would have died in a fight against that creature. The man also added that the demon had been killed by a mystery man, and Nor thought there were some outstanding people out there. Afterward, when the man was trying again to convince Nor to quit being an F-rank adventurer and find a decent job, Lin appeared, which shocked all the people present. However, the sacred book of tropes indicates that nothing must be revealed at that point. In the end, after a very carefully scripted conversation, he agreed to go out with her, with the guildmaster still being oblivious that Nor had saved her the night before, and with Nor oblivious of the lady's identity. Thanks to her concealment and soundproofing skills, they managed to walk around the city without being detected. And once they got to a more discreet place, she apologized to him for showing up so abruptly and asking him to go outside when he was talking with the guildmaster. She then thanked him again for saving his life. She even told him that what he had done amounted to saving the lives of many others in the nation. Of course, he quickly dismissed all that and downplayed his role in the fight. He is dense, yes, that's a fact. But she sucks at explaining things. Is it that hard to tell him he had killed a powerful demon and had saved the princess of that kingdom in the process? Afterward, Lin told him that she wanted to properly thank him, but he refused. She then told him that his father wanted to meet him, but he refused again. She then said that she was a person of status who wanted to give something to the person to whom she owed his life. For a while, she insisted on him accepting her gratitude only for being rejected, but her efforts ended up paying off because he eventually yielded and accepted to meet her father, but he said he didn't want anything extravagant. Right after, she used his skills again and took our protagonist to her manor. Once they entered the place, she asked him again for his name, and that time he revealed his name was Nor. At that time, she apologized because she realized had forgotten to introduce herself. She then told him her name was Lindbergh Clays, but asked him to call her Lin instead, and the part where you say you are a princess. After a while, they met with Inez and Lin informed her she wanted to see her father. The blonde knight told her that he was currently in the audience chambers speaking with Rain. The princess then revealed that the man with her was the one who had risked his life to save her from that attack. Inez then offered to guide them to Lin's father, although she didn't hide the fact that she was wary of him. After a while, they met with a young man called Gilbert who immediately showed hostility towards Nor for no reason. Luckily, the blonde woman intervened to prevent things from escalating, although she secretly asked him to join them because the more escorts the better. As for the king, he was telling Rain that Doritas didn't care about the non-aggression treaty or anything. After all, he had already demanded them to hand over all the rights to the dungeon. At that moment, Lin's group arrived and Rain reprimanded her for having gone outside. She told his older brother that she needed to find the person who had saved her life no matter what. After hearing that, the king asked his daughter if Nor was the man, and she confirmed it. Our protagonist then apologized for not knowing the proper etiquette and for the way he was dressing since he hadn't expected to go there that day. The king laughed at those words and formally thanked him. The king then tried to reward him, but Nor refused, which put the king in an awkward position. After considering things for a while, the king took a giant sword that was hanging on a wall and offered it to our him. Rain was astonished after seeing that, but the king ignored him, saying that at that point the sword had already become nothing more than a mere decoration. Nor finally accepted it and was surprised after realizing how heavy it was. However, he made a last attempt to reject it, but the king refused. Lin's father then asked Nor to give it a swing, and our protagonist did it after activating his physical enhancement. What he didn't know was that the swing had impressed everybody because he had managed to swing it one-handed. Not to mention, Nor even said the sword was not that heavy. And I would bet a house on that sword being a legendary weapon or something like that. Afterward, the king asked our protagonist to help toughen Lin up. After all, things were dangerous those days, and he was worried about her. However, he refused and even said that it was not good for parents to interfere too much with their daughters, which almost made Inez burst with anger. Luckily, the king diffused the situation by laughing to show everybody he had taken no offense. Right after, Noor bid farewell to the king and left the hall without knowing he had killed a demon and had saved the princess of that kingdom. However, before he left the place, Inez stopped him saying she wanted to talk to him. The blonde knight then kneeled before him and apologized for her rudeness. Her demeanor hadn't been appropriate for the one who had saved Lady Lindbergh's life. She then explained that her job was to protect the people of the Clay's family from all dangers, and that took precedence over the way she treated guests. She then introduced herself as Inez Harness and added that she was vice captain of the Clay's family's warrior corps. She also said she was known as the Divine Shield. Finally, she told him that from that moment onwards she would help him however she could. After all, by saving Lynn's life, he had also saved hers. He accepted, and right after, she told him that his speech and behavior, while in an audience with the king, had been unpardonable, and warned him should he continue like that in the future, she would no longer be able to overlook his disrespect. He thanked for the warning, but he didn't seem that much affected by those words. Finally, she asked for his name, and when he told her he was called Noor, she reacted strangely. Right after she left, but before our protagonist could move, Gilbert confronted him and asked him to spar with him. Noor was walking through a corridor with Gilbert while wondering what could possibly that man need from him. Not to mention he was exhausted and wanted to go home as soon as possible. Eventually, they arrived at what seemed to be a sparring ring, and our protagonist asked the other what he wanted, and Gilbert replied that he wanted to have a mock battle with him. That reminded Noor that he hadn't had a training partner since he had gone to those schools. Gilbert then told him that although he might not seem like it, he was quite famous in the royal capital. He then invited our protagonist to pick one of the training weapons that were hanging on one of the walls. Noor immediately grabbed a sword while thinking that was a godsend for a budding adventurer. Shortly after, they both were ready to fight, and our protagonist thought that he didn't know how much of a challenge he would be for him. But even though, he was willing to take that as a chance to train with someone more skillful than him. By the way, the other guards that were there couldn't believe that someone was willing to fight against their captain. The battle began, and Noor immediately was amazed by the polished movements of the other and the way he controlled his pace. In fact, he was sure that Gilbert had trained like crazy to achieve that level. However, Noor soon noticed something else. Gilbert's movements were too slow, and he couldn't understand why. Until the realization finally hit him, he has finally realized that he is very strong. After some consideration, our protagonist concluded that since Gilbert was battling against a weakling like him, he probably saw no point in showing even a glimpse of what he could really do. At that moment, he asked Gilbert to stop and told him that he knew he was going easy on him, but he informed him that he didn't have to hold back that much. Those words caught his attention, and the captain even wondered if he indeed had taken it down a notch because his opponent was a normal human. Gilbert quickly apologized and right after resumed his attacks, unleashing all his power. Noor immediately noticed that the other was way faster than before, yet he could still evade his attacks, and more importantly, the moment our protagonist evaded the captain, he left himself completely open. It was like he was luring him in. As for the captain, he was beginning to wonder why his spear wouldn't touch our protagonist. Meanwhile, Noor kept thinking the other wasn't fighting seriously, and his next explanation was that Gilbert had simply set a trap. I am currently amazed by the fact that this guy doesn't choke while eating. The captain then decided to use a sword skill and a feint, but Noor still managed to dodge his attacks, although our protagonist finally had to put some effort into doing it. Afterward, Noor stopped the fight again and told Gilbert that he could still handle more, so he could speed up, which startled the other. That reaction made Noor finally consider the possibility that the other was already giving it all he's got. He even thought that all the training he had done in those 14 years had made him stronger. Our protagonist even thought he might win the mock battle. Immediately thereafter, Gilbert used a powerful skill called Dragrave, which apparently was one of his best skills. In fact, that movement finally caught Noor by surprise, but even though he managed to dodge it, albeit barely. However, Nor immediately admitted defeat and left the manor feeling troubled. The other guards couldn't believe that someone had actually evaded that movement, and only felt better after justifying it on the fact that Gilbert was using a practice spear with a wide tip. As for the captain, he began to recall the time when he had begun training. From the beginning, he knew he had talent for the spear, and the more he trained, the more polished his technique and the more strength he gained. Unfortunately, he quickly got bored because he couldn't find a worthy opponent. It was then that his master told him to go to the capital that was assembling its power for an upcoming war. Sadly, even after going there and fighting both demons and other powerful humans, he couldn't find the opponent he was looking for. He kept winning with ease, but he knew that wasn't enough. One day, the swordsman instructor found him resting and told him that he looked gloomy for someone who had obtained the honorable alias of Spear Sovereign. Gilbert didn't flinch and told him that it was just another bothersome title, which amused the instructor, who said that he didn't realize a title equal to his sword sovereign rank was such a burden. However, the captain didn't back down and even told him he would like to fight him, but the instructor didn't take him seriously, although he told him that someday there would appear someone who would surpass him. Back to the present, the captain recalled he wanted to know what kind of person could defeat a minotaur all on his own, but our protagonist made no sense. He showed not 1 ounce of interest in the most lavish of rewards, and he was discourteous even in audience with the king. In fact, he didn't believe that our protagonist had the power to kill that monster at all. However, he had gone all out with his final attack. That move was faster than the speed of sound, and above all, it was his most powerful technique. In fact, he recognized he had been reckless by using it, but he wanted Nor to feel the power of his spear. Nevertheless, despite Gilbert didn't know what had exactly happened, he was aware that for the first time in a head-on battle, he had been thoroughly defeated. Yet, the other had admitted defeat instead. The captain then wondered if Nor was showing concern for him because they were in front of his subordinates. Moreover, the most intriguing part was that after our protagonist left, the captain noticed several huge cracks on the floor, and he had no idea when those cracks had appeared or how Norn had done that. Nevertheless, one thing was certain. Our protagonist had evaded Gilbert's best technique while he was at full strength. Meaning, it seemed our boy had finally found the worthy opponent he had been looking for. As for our protagonist, he was amazed because that last attack had been outstanding. Sadly, that broke his confidence because after using physical enhancement and feather step to avoid it, he attributed his success at dodging it to the fact that the captain had held back just enough so that he could get away. Otherwise, he would have died. Nor even went as far as to think that Gilbert had gone out of his way to warn him that pride would lead to death. Oh, for the love of all that is sacred, I knew it. I knew this would happen, but I didn't imagine our protagonist would use such a roundabout way in order to undervalue his own strength. This guy takes the concept of stretching reality to a whole new level. Some time passed, and one day, while he was resting on a hill and finding new ways of underestimating his power, Lynn met with him and told him that she had a special request for him. She wanted him to accept her as his page. Of course, our protagonist had no idea what a page was, and she quickly explained that a page was someone who took care of his master's everyday necessities, as he learned techniques and absorbed knowledge from him. Obviously, after hearing that, he immediately refused her request, but she insisted, saying that if he let her stay, she was sure she could be of use to him. After all, he had achieved the highest marks ever in all 6 training schools. Nevertheless, he told her that there was nothing at all that he could teach her. I don't know, maybe how to kill a minotaur. Furthermore, he could do what he needed to on his own. She then changed her approach and told him that her family would pay him a handsome instructor's fee, but he refused again. She didn't give up, though, and began showcasing all her abilities by showing him the most powerful techniques she had learned in the 6 training schools. Yet he still refused her request while thinking that he had mistaken him for a person who was worth learning from. He told her that it had become more and more obvious there was nothing he could teach her. Noor decided to show her reality and used Tiny Flame so she could realize his talent was mediocre. What he didn't know was that Oaken had told her that the size of the flame would depend on how hard you had trained and how well you comprehended the technique. So Lin was flabbergasted when she saw that Noor's flame was several times bigger than Oaken's. Well, it is confirmed, size does matter in that world. She even recalled those fairy tales about a young boy who managed to complete the full term for each of the 6 training schools in just 3 months. Up to that moment, she also thought that the young boy didn't exist, but after seeing that tiny flame, she was sure Noor was indeed him. Noor told her that his other skills had the same level, which left her completely defeated. After all, she had just made fun of herself after showcasing her poor skills to that monumentally powerful person. That night, Lin appeared in front of Noor again and called him Sensei because she had decided that she would follow him everywhere until she accepted her as his page. Rain was in his office wondering what his father was thinking giving our protagonist, a man of unknown lineage, the Black Blade. Don't try to understand that. Plot armor is strong on Noor. The prince recalled that his father had obtained that sword back in the day when he was an adventurer. He had pushed into the deepest corner of the Dungeon of the Lost with the Sovereign Six. It had been a long and dangerous quest that yielded a prime dungeon relic. That blade was made of an unknown material, harder than mithril or a chalcum, and monometal. In fact, no matter the technique or skill used, nothing caused even a scratch on it. That had earned the weapon the title of Unbreakable Blade. It was obvious that the sword had value beyond that of a weapon. That made things clear. Although, the prince ended up considering the fact of his father had noticed the sense of unrest hanging over their country. In all likelihood, the king was counting on that man. As for Noor, he was with Lin eating in a stall. He was worried about the princess being seen outside. But she quickly reassured him, saying that she was first and foremost a simp. By the way, in this episode of How to Be the Densest Creature in the World, our protagonist kept thinking that he was not someone who should be considered an instructor. But the more he tried to clear up the misunderstanding, the more complicated that situation got. Perhaps if you both stop assuming things and spoke to each other clearly. Sigh, what I am even thinking, this is an anime. This trope will follow the protagonist till the end of time. Sometime later, they arrived at the guild, and the guild master asked him what was he doing with Lady Lindbergh. But in the end, he decided to let that pass and ended up offering them a goblin hunting job. After all, since the lady was B rank, they could take that quest as a party. Of course, he couldn't help but ask if she was okay with him taking advantage of her rank. And she quickly replied she was okay with that since he was her instructor. Now, the guildmaster is either a master concealing his emotions, or he's deaf. It's amazing he didn't react after hearing that Noor was the instructor of a B-rank adventurer. The guildmaster then explained the details of the quest, and right after they left the city and headed to the Forest of Beast, he was excited because it was his first quest outside the walls. And she was excited because she would be able to see his sensei fighting for real. Once they got to the forest, he asked her to tell him what she knew about goblins. The question surprised her, but still, she answered it to the best of her knowledge, thinking it had been a test. As for our protagonist, her reply confirmed to him that he had nothing to teach her. They kept walking and found it strange that no goblin had appeared so far. However, Lin soon felt the presence of a monster, and they both went further into the forest to investigate. They kept walking, and suddenly she felt how the presence she had detected before had disappeared. Nevertheless, they kept going, and shortly after Noor noticed the body of a goblin being dismembered. And after Lin cast a spell, they uncovered a huge goblin that had been eating the other one. Noor couldn't believe adventurers fought those enormous creatures like it was nothing, because they didn't. That's obviously a rare mutation or something, and he thought Lin was terrified due to her lack of combat experience. However, since ignorance is bliss, he quickly told her they had to fight that creature since it was just a goblin, which boosted her confidence because she thought that to him, even a goblin emperor, a subspecies of the goblin king, that was considered an extreme threat. was nothing. The misunderstandings here are getting Inception levels. Misunderstandings within misunderstandings. The goblin began its attack, but Nor quickly parried all its movements. His strategy was to act as a tank and leave the damage dealing to Lin. Unfortunately, the monster was very fast, and she wasn't able to hit it. The Goblin Emperor began throwing trees at Nor, but he easily parried all those attacks while Lin was analyzing the situation. Luckily, she quickly noticed a mana stone located in the monster's forehead and told our protagonist that if they could get that off, they just might beat it. Of course, the goblin didn't plan to give them any more time to think, and it began throwing more trees, to the point of making Nor unable to parry all of them. Fortunately, Lin used a wind spell to repel the trees and cut the monster in the process, but sadly, the monster's wounds kept getting healed thanks to the mana stone. The bad news was that, at that rate, they would just run out of stamina and magic. Moreover, Nor thought that if Lin's magic attacks couldn't hit the monster, nothing he could do would work. This is when a running gag begins to transform into something dangerous. Nevertheless, our protagonist suddenly had a moment of inspiration and asked Lin if she could aim her wind spell at his back. The lady tried to warn him that the spell was powerful enough to demolish castle walls, but he reassured her saying he would use the sword to withstand the blast. Furthermore, that was their only chance of becoming faster than the creature. This protagonist is filling the Goku archetype. He is a genius at fights, but an idiot at everything else. Lin then aimed the spells towards his back and sent Nor at an amazing speed towards the creature. Our protagonist had to use all the skills he knew in order to withstand the blast, but in the end, he managed to hit the mana stone in the creature's forehead before it could defend itself. Immediately thereafter, the gem fell from the monster's forehead and the goblin began to scream while grabbing its head with its hands. At that moment, Lin arrived next to Nor and showed him the stone. He then asked her to finish it off, but making sure it didn't suffer much. Afterward, she got close to the creature, and before it could attack her, she killed it with a fire spell. Nor then arrived near her while thinking he was going to refrain from any more goblin slaying for a long while. Oh, that's the reason why they cast another protagonist for the Goblin Slayer anime. He also said to himself that he shouldn't get overconfident and go into dangerous situations. What you should do is properly assess your strength to have a real idea of what would be dangerous to you in the first place. But I guess that would kill the series' premise. Sometime later, a group of undercover agents gave Rain the Mana Stone while informing him that there was a Goblin Emperor in the Forest of Beasts, one that was several times the size of a Goblin King. Obviously, the prince quickly suspected there was something abnormal about that and told the others that the magical empire might be responsible for that incident. Moreover, that Mana Stone was suspected of being a demon's heart from the holy theocracy of Mithra. Rain then asked about his sister, and they reported that she had gotten only minor wounds. That surprised the prince, who said it was amazing how they had been able to overcome it. After all, the agents reported that the monster had hidden behind a powerful seal and had ambushed them. In fact, the princess believed it had been there for a few days, perhaps more. That astonished the prince because it implied that the seal had been so powerful that not even the secret corps had been able to perceive it. That led to another question because he couldn't understand how they had been able to carry such a bulky thing all the way to their country in the first place. After all, if it had been summoning magic, the sensory network in the capital should have caught it. Or not. The agents of that department hadn't detected the seal. In my eyes, they are as competent as Disney's showrunners. Rain then asked the agents if there had been some telltale signs in the perimeter, to which they replied that the number of goblins was decreasing. So the Adventurers Guild had requested an investigation into it. And yet, they didn't discover anything. They are useless. The prince quickly warned the others that there might have been several similar cases in other areas as well. And one of the agents gave him a report that summarized all the questionable instances from the last 3 months. Back at the guild master congratulated Nor for a job well done, and our protagonist replied that it had been way harder than what he had imagined it would be. and gave all the credit for defeating the monster to Lin. As for the guild master, he simply assumed our protagonist had watched the battle from the sidelines and told him that goblins could be a threat even for newbies, so he should take that as a good way for earning experience. You know, this man should be fired from his position. It's a miracle the city hadn't fallen with that waste of space in charge of the Adventurers Guild. By the way, in case you wonder, no, the fact that they killed a goblin emperor instead of a regular goblin was conveniently omitted during the entire conversation. No, it was worse. When the guild master began suspecting something was wrong, Lin quickly downplayed the whole thing with a lame explanation, and both men accepted it. Not even Inspector Gadget, heck, not even Hong Kong Fooey was that dense. The guild master then asked them for the goblin's right ear as proof of the quest completion before he could pay them, and Lin and Nor realized they had burned the monster when they killed it. No money for you. Now that was funny. Try to parry that. You deserve that and worse for being dense. Rain was reading the report that summarized all the questionable instances from the last 3 months, and after a while, he concluded that perhaps the enemy had already encroached very deep into their country. Right after, he ordered all members who could use search and uncover to form a group and dispatch to the designated areas. He also ordered to call for all 6 sovereigns and informed them that was an emergency summon. Once his men left, the prince began recriminating himself for having overlooked the plot and began wondering what was happening. The worst part was that the prince still couldn't understand why the Empire was doing that to them. Maybe refusing to give them a dungeon they seemed to badly want could have something to do with it. Well, he knew the Empire wanted the dungeon's resources, but he couldn't accept they had decided to resort to that scheme, especially because that plot would put a lot of innocent lives in the line of fire. If the plot was true, that would mean the Empire intended to demolish their country. Back with our protagonist, he was eating with Lin in some stall while she told him that it had been a good thing they had gotten compensated in the end. Come on, guild master. Why? Dishonor on you. Dishonor on your cow. At least he didn't give them the rewards, but a little present in celebration of their first hunt. But still. As for Nor, he was wondering how long Lin was going to stick around, especially since her folks should be worried about her. Luckily for him, she decided to let him go for the time being and told him that she was going to return home. Of course, he let him know that she would assist him again if he didn't mind her doing so. At that precise moment, Rain appeared and, without even saying hi, he asked our protagonist to head to a city in the mountain district the next day in the morning, along with Lin. He added that he was going to give them a carriage as well as one escort. The prince then apologized for being unable to give Nor any more details at that moment, but thanked him in advance for cooperating with them. Our protagonist quickly agreed and said he would need to pack for that journey. After hearing that, Rain replied that they would pay him well and cover their travel expenses. In fact, after the prince placed the request through the guild master told Nor he should relax since it was a pretty sweet deal. I insist, I've seen many incompetent authority figures in anime, but that guild master is quickly paving his way to the top. The next day, they began their journey, and Nor thought he had never been on a carriage before, so he wanted to see what it was like. However, while he was very happy enjoying the scenery, Lin was crestfallen to the point a dense man like him noticed it. Sadly, since our protagonist has the social skills of a potato, he was unable to find out the reason for her behavior. She then apologized for her brother having burdened him with that request, but Nor downplayed the whole thing, saying he was getting paid, not to mention he still owed her for the goblin hunt. A flashback then began showing the moment when Rain told them the details of the quest. Their final destination would be the holy theocracy of Mithra. But according to his instructions, it was clear that he was sending them as scouts, relying on Nor's strength. The problem was that our protagonist didn't catch the implications of the quest. Not to mention he hadn't realized yet how strong he was. On the other hand, Lin did manage to understand the underlying text and got worried. As I said before, following a trope blindly can be dangerous. Back to the present, Lin told Noor that she truly hoped nothing happened. At that moment, Inez told them they shouldn't be worried because that was why she was there. She then recalled the secret order the prince had given her. He had said that shortly the royal capital would fall into an unprecedented crisis, so if she received a report of the destruction of the capital, she should take Lin together with Noor and flee to the holy theocracy of Mithra. Obviously, Inez asked him if Lin knew that, but the prince replied he hadn't told her because he was sure she would surely refuse to leave. In fact, the vice captain told him that she couldn't be away if there was an emergency in the capital, but Rain said that her duty was of the utmost importance. She had to take Lin somewhere safe, and he couldn't trust anyone else with that task. I don't like where this is going. Back to the present, Inez apologized to Noor for having involved him, but he simply replied that she was making a simple trip sound very serious. Inez then showed him her divine shield, a skill that allowed her to create a shield of light in front of her. Neither weapons nor magic could get through it, for the most part. After seeing that, he couldn't help but admire her since he knew she was very powerful, even as powerful as Gilbert. On the other hand, he felt way inferior since a single goblin had given him a lot of trouble. I would like to hear their opinions on Noor killing a goblin emperor almost by himself. The vice captain then began to recall her past, and a flashback began showing her childhood when she discovered her power. In fact, back then, Oaken told her that her gift could become a blade to cut anyone down or a shield that could protect against anything. Afterward, she was taken in by the sovereign shield Dandalg, and she learned from the 6 sovereigns how to use her power. Nevertheless, she couldn't dispel the fear that she would hurt someone again since she had hurt a friend by mistake with her power. That fear made her to put distance between her and others. In fact, she thought she had become detached from the things they said and did, but that belief crashed when she heard Noor's name. She knew that name because her master, Dandalg, seemed to hold that person in high regard, which made her feel envious. A feeling that had gotten worse from the moment he had appeared in front of her. Back to the present, she reprimanded herself, reminding her that she shouldn't let her feelings cloud her judgment since she was the shield of the Clay's kingdom, and her duty was to protect Lin with her life. At that moment, Noor realized there was a strange path in the wheat fields that were on the side of the road, and when he informed that to the ladies, Lin quickly used her Uncover spell to discover a big-winged monster that had been hiding under a magic veil. Meanwhile, in the capital, the attack had begun and several beasts had appeared surrounding the city. The warrior corps were trying to handle the situation, but they didn't have enough soldiers. Rain then ordered the swordsman troop to block the roads immediately to fend them off while evacuating the citizens. Afterward, the prince told the king he feared that was just the beginning, which the other agreed. To make things worse, the 6 sovereigns had been previously dispatched to stop the attacks of various monsters that had appeared in different locations. Of course, the king immediately realized the enemy's strategy was divide and conquer. The main culprit here is that dumb guild master, Fight Me. As for Rain, he tried to find comfort in the fact that his sister was safe. Speaking of the sister, the monster they had discovered was not alone. A human boy was with it, and apparently he had the mission to kill some people, although he looked like he had been forced to do it. In fact, when their cover was blown, the Black Death Dragon hit him before facing Noor's attack. While our protagonist fought the monster, the boy couldn't help but marvel at Noor's strength, and Inez made Lin notice that the boy had appeared along with the monster, which meant they were both together. The final piece to complete the opening's puzzle had appeared. Lin was astonished after hearing that because she couldn't believe the boy was a demonfolk. Demonfolks appeared to be the same as humans, but they were demi-humans who had the special ability to establish a mental bond with monsters at will, which put them closer to monsters than humans. That's why people considered them abhorrent. The demonfolks were thought to be extinct, but it seemed their descendants were somehow still around according to what Rain had told Lin before she left the capital. Inez then said that Black Death Dragons were monsters that dwelled in the marshlands, and they rarely went where humans resided. which confirmed Lin's thoughts that the boy had manipulated the dragon to go there. In fact, Inez was convinced that the boy was trying to take that vicious monster to the royal capital. Furthermore, she also had guessed that the shock of being exposed by the uncover spell had caused him to lose his mental hold on the dragon. Additionally, the vice captain thought she couldn't believe how Noor had rushed to help someone like that. She considered his action as a foolish decision, and somehow seeing him doing that pissed her off. Lin then tried to help our protagonist, but Inez stopped her, saying she wouldn't help him again. As for Noor, he thought that the monster was not very powerful and it moved slowly, so he planned to hold out until Lin and Inez got there. Unfortunately, the dragon used a breath attack against him, which put him in a tough situation since he knew that evading the attack would mean the kid getting hit by it. In the end, Noor decided to parry that one too, but once he did, he got poisoned to the point of losing control of his body. He then recalled that Inez had tried to stop him from fighting the frog, and he finally realized that perhaps she had tried to tell him it was a poisonous one. Yes, he thought the dragon was a big frog, but to be fair, it indeed looks like a winged frog. Meanwhile, Inez explained to Lin that the true danger of that dragon was its poison. The princess then tried to go help Noor, but the vice captain stopped her again because, at that moment, the very existence of the kingdom might depend on her survival. The dragon then threw an even bigger breath attack, and Inez warned Lin that one breath of that gas would be fatal even in the presence of the sovereign healer. The vice captain then used her shield to block the attack, while mentally apologizing to Noor. After all, she had chosen that path because she admired her master. However, once the smoke dissipated, she could see Noor was still fighting, even while being in a terrible condition, which made her recall why her master held him in high regard. She then concluded that Noor's philosophy was doing whatever he could to protect someone, even if that meant sacrificing yourself, which was the way of a true shield. Unfortunately, after parrying several attacks, Noor couldn't keep fighting and fell, but while agonizing, he felt good with himself because he had managed to save the kid. A flashback begins, showing the kid who was controlling the dragon when he was imprisoned. Apparently, some kids were considered cursed children because at birth they possessed the cursed power to control magical beasts. They were treated like trash, and the kid recalled that he had heard that a long time ago his ability was considered a liability that only controlled livestock. But then someone had started to use it to control monsters in a war and killed a lot of people, and from that moment onwards they had become loathed. Every day they were tortured for no reason. Even crossing eyes with a guard was enough to get beaten into a pulp. According to the kid, being sent flying by a kick was also a daily occurrence. In fact, one day he had been beaten until he was almost unrecognizable just for asking a question. He didn't know why, but he was able to read the minds of anyone in front of him, which was especially painful when he was exhibited like an animal inside a cage so the people could insult him. In fact, when the people discovered he had that skill, they got even more violent. Nevertheless, no matter what awful things happened to him, he never retaliated. In fact, he had never thought of doing so. Even though he hated being loathed, abused, and beaten, he had never ever wanted to think about hurting anyone else. More than anything, he just didn't want to see any more blood. Nevertheless, on a certain day, one of the wardens arrived at his cell. He was accompanied by various monsters, and he told the kid that he could help a certain country by taking those monsters with him. He also said that demon folks could be useful to people. They could be useful to the nation. Of course, the kid found that opportunity appealing because he wanted to be useful. Not to mention that the man told him that he would never be beaten for no reason again, and that he would let him eat his fill of delicious meats if he did what he said. In fact, to make the offer more appealing, the man added that the benefits would be not only for him, but for everyone in the prison. Of course, the man also reminded him that if he didn't accept the offer, he would get the same treatment as before. Perhaps he would be treated even worse. Unfortunately, the kid couldn't read his mind because the man was wearing a magical device on his forehead, but he knew that the man always kept his promises. That was the reason for him accepting the job. Moreover, back to the present when the seal was broken and the dragon attacked him, he thought he had somehow messed up and was scared, thinking that everyone was going to suffer again because of him. In the end, he was about to die, unable to help anyone, and his only comfort was thinking he at least hadn't hurt anyone either. In fact, he was happy to die and only hoped that if he was reborn he wouldn't get beaten so badly in his next life. He could be useful to someone, and he could have something delicious to eat at least once. Nevertheless, death didn't arrive because our protagonist appeared to protect him. That surprised the kid, who couldn't understand why the man was protecting him. Noor gave his all fighting the monster, but soon he couldn't move anymore and fell, although he was happy to have protected the kid. A new flashback began, showing a young Noor paying respects to his parents' graves before going to gather some ingredients in the mountains. He then recalled that it all had started after he returned from the training schools in the royal capital, at dinner time. He couldn't be sure if all the herbs he gathered were edible, but he thought that worst case scenario, it would just give him a bit of a stomachache. However, that evening he got seriously poisoned after eating the meal he had prepared. He began to bleed profusely, and the only thing he could do was to cast low heal on himself while hoping for the better. He somehow managed to stay alive up to the next day, and after reading a book that was at home, he could identify the poisonous herb he had eaten. Nevertheless, he still intended to train while coughing blood and barely being able to walk. Finally, after some days, he began to feel better and could resume his daily activities, only to get bitten by a poisonous snake. A while later, he regained consciousness and noticed he was feeling all right, and his next action was to eat the snake that had bitten him. The next day, he captured another snake and allowed it to bite him. He then noticed that the poison was spreading slower than the day before. That made him happy because he concluded he had gained some tolerance. In fact, he thought that he could gain a new skill that way, and from that moment onwards, he developed a taste for poisonous things. In the end, he couldn't acquire any skills using that method, but was able to eat poisonous things at the cost of vomiting a small amount of blood. Back to the present, Noor stood up while thinking that he had probably survived because of the tolerance he had gained before. Not to mention that he was eager to eat that dragon since it looked delicious to him. Noor then dodged another attack from the monster and thought that at first he hadn't been able to counteract the poison in time, so he had spewed a little bit of blood. But he knew from experience that that much was no big deal. He then checked the condition of the kid and was glad to see he was okay. It seemed like the detoxification of his low heal had taken effect in time. Afterward, the battle resumed, with Noor parrying all the attacks from the dragon to the point of making it hurt itself with each blow. Of course, that made the kid admire him for being able to take on such a horrible creature by himself. The dragon then decided to use another breath attack, but that one looked way bigger than the others, and Noor immediately realized that was the frog's all-or-nothing death strike. Nevertheless, our protagonist managed to parry the attack before it could launch it, causing its head to explode, and leaving Anise, Lin, and the kid flabbergasted. Once the battle was over, he looked at the monster and couldn't help but find it strange that such a huge and dangerous frog was outside the city. But above all, he still thought that it should probably be pretty tasty. He then went to where the kid was and asked if he was okay. Afterward, he asked him if he had gotten there all by himself, and the other quickly clarified that he had been the one who had taken that monster there because he had promised to take it to the city. That surprised Noor because he couldn't understand why the kid had gone through all that trouble to take that poison frog there. I remember it is a dragon, but Noor considers it a frog, and it looks like a winged frog, so it is a frog. Right after, our protagonist arrived at the most logical conclusion and realized the frog was going to be used to attack the city, which made him wary of the kid. Nah, I am kidding. Of course, he wouldn't be able to arrive at that conclusion. That would be beyond his capabilities. No, according to his advanced reasoning, that frog should have been for eating. In the end, he thought the kid was traveling incognito to be safe and not getting robbed. As for the poison, he was sure that a large city would have the techniques to handle it properly. He even thought that those frogs were raised like cows on a farm. His delusion went to the point of making him feel very bad for having ruined the delivery of the kid's precious stock to the city. At this point, I should want someone to clarify the situation for him, but to be honest, I prefer seeing him suffering. He then apologized to the kid and offered him he would pay for the damage caused. Obviously, the kid got flustered after hearing that and quickly told him that it wasn't necessary. Afterward, Noor asked him how he had taken the frog there, and the kid revealed he could control monsters. Our protagonist was amazed by that and told him that was an amazing skill. He even asked him if there were others in the world who could do that. The kid didn't comprehend what he meant by skill and said he had been born with it. That impressed Noor even more. He told the kid that something like that could only be a talent gifted from the heavens. The kid was on the verge of tears at that point and decided to reveal he was a demon folk, and added that all demon folks could do that. Right after, Noor began to explain all the things he had imagined he would do if he had that ability. The kid was surprised by his attitude and asked him if he wasn't afraid of him. He then said that there were people who were scared of and also hated that he had that power. However, Noor couldn't understand his point and only told him he shouldn't pay attention to that. They could say what they wanted, but that was a super useful ability in his opinion. Now, what could possibly be waiting for Inez and Lin to go see if Noor was okay? And what was the real goal of the kid? Of course, those words made the kid cry because someone had finally told him he could be useful. Noor then thought that unlike himself, the kid had been blessed with a desirable ability. At that point, Lin and Inez arrived and he told them he was okay because he was strong against poison. Nevertheless, the princess still couldn't believe our protagonist was okay. After all, along with the poison there had been also miasma. She was sure of that. And that was an extreme poison that even ruined the soil in its path. The only way of surviving after taking a direct attack like that was having a sacred spirit. Instructor Sane, the sovereign of salvation, had once shown it to her. By honing the body and mind like a saint, the technique purified everything it touched. It had been the perfection he had finally found at the end of his unconventional training. Noor then introduced the kid to the ladies, who immediately got on guard. Afterward, in a very, very convoluted way, Inez and Lin understood the kid was a slave who a mysterious person had used to attack the city. Moreover, nobody explained to Noor why demon folks were hated by the people. They didn't even tell him that people hated them in the first place. Afterward, our protagonist told the ladies he wanted to give the kid a ride to the nearest city. At first, Lin wanted to refuse, but she then remembered his father's words about not being misled by rumors and trusting her own eyes and agreed to Noor's plan. Right after, the kid introduced himself as Rollo and Lin asked Inez if they could take the kid with them. The vice captain was about to refuse, but Noor stopped her, saying that if there was no room for him, he could have his spot in the carriage. Inez then explained that demon folks were not allowed entry into the holy theocracy of Mithra, which was their destination, so taking him with them would be complicated. Nevertheless, if they left him there, it would be difficult for him to survive alone. It was a tough situation, but before they could say anything else, another person arrived. It was a mysterious warrior who wore a handkerchief to cover his eyes and who looked at the group menacingly. The newcomer saw the dead frog and told Rollo that he had screwed the delivery he was supposed to make. Right after, Noor asked the mysterious man if he had been the one who had asked the kid to deliver the monster, and the other replied that he was just a hired hand. The man then asked if Noor had been the one who had killed the frog, and our protagonist quickly apologized, saying he didn't know it was an important delivery. The mysterious man replied that he couldn't care less about who had messed up with the delivery. After all, his business was related to the kid. The newcomer had been hired to take the kid back. Noor looked hopeful that the kid would be able to return to his home safely and asked the man if he was there to pick up the kid. The newcomer confirmed it, saying the kid was worth quite a lot. Immediately after that, he disappeared and appeared behind our protagonist trying to kill him. Nevertheless, Noor parried the attack while asking why he had done that. The man then said that our protagonist was on his way and asked if he would mind handing the kid to him because his carcass was very valuable. After hearing those words, Noor finally began to suspect something fishy was going on and asked the man why he had meant by his carcass, to which the newcomer replied while attacking our protagonist that he could take the kid back alive and let his client murder it, but he had decided to do them a favor and kill the kid himself. Noor kept parrying the other's attacks while saying he didn't understand what the newcomer was talking about. The mysterious man then said our protagonist didn't have to understand and tried to jump over him to kill Rollo. Nevertheless, Noor was faster and appeared in front of him to parry that attack too, breaking the man's sword in the process. Meanwhile, Lin didn't know what was happening because the newcomer and Noor were moving so fast she couldn't see a thing. Right after, Inez told her to make sure she didn't leave her side. Back to the fight, the man said Noor was a weird one and immediately thereafter changed his weapon for 2 daggers. Sadly, his next attacks were also parried by our protagonist. That finally began to piss the newcomer off, and he told Noor that he was in his way, so he would have to start by lopping his head right off. The newcomer then launched an attack so powerful that it managed to send our protagonist back various meters despite it being parried. Of course, that made Noor realize this opponent was stronger than the Minotaur he had fought before. Nevertheless, the man also had to admit our protagonist was not an easy one because one of his daggers broke after the attack. However, the man was not ready to give up, and after taking out another dagger, he resumed his attacks. Noor then thought that fighting him while protecting Rollo would make him run out of stamina very fast, and the newcomer wondered why our protagonist didn't die. The battle was so intense that Inez had to use her divine shield in order to protect both her and Lin from the shockwaves. The vice captain also told the princess that if they carelessly got too close to the fight, they would be swept up in that skirmish. After all, for her, there was no mistake. That bizarre appearance meant the newcomer was Deadman, a former S-rank adventurer called Deadman Zadu. The vice captain then recalled a conversation he had had with the Sovereign Six about him. They told her that he was officially dead and advised both her and Gilbert to not fight him because he was too strong for anyone. They told both of them that, as a kid, Deadman had mastered the ancient art of dwarven alchemy, and at the tender age of 13 he had earned the name Dragon Slayer. In short, he had managed to become the apex of all adventurers. Unfortunately, he had turned to the dark side, and some in the Guild Association even suggested that he should be stripped of his adventurer's license. The problem was that the contributions he had made to the guild were significant, and he had also taken down a disaster-level threat of a monster on his own. In the end, the leaders were divided and the matter was put on hold. In the meantime, he had turned out into a mercenary, accepting any kind of job as long as he was being paid. He had even wiped out the army of a country on his own before murdering the entire royal family. Back to reality, Deadman was beginning to have fun while fighting Noor, who could only parry his attacks. Meanwhile, Inez told Lin that Zadu had been challenged by multitudes of adventurers whose goal was the vast bounty on his head, but it had only ended in a mountain of corpses as the amount for the reward went higher and higher. So, to prevent any more meaningless casualties, the guild had announced publicly that he had been successfully killed. Back to the fight, the last of Deadman's daggers broke, and Noor justified himself, saying it had been the newcomer's fault for suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. As for the man, he couldn't understand why the daggers made of orichalcum and dragon tusk had broken. Zadu then decided to play safe and used his main weapon, an cross-like sword. He threw it upwards, and it divided into dozens of copies. He then introduced his weapon as Silver Cross and told Noor he could break as many as he wanted because he could easily make more. Zadu then threw all the swords towards Nor and Rollo, and although our protagonist could parry a lot of them, he had to let others stab him in order to protect the kid. After seeing that, Inez knew that she had to help them. But in the end, she forced herself to stay put since her mission was to make sure Lin made it safely into exile. Afterward, the vice captain asked the princess for permission to leave her and assist our protagonist in battle. Back to the fight, Nor kept parrying the swords, but when another group of them was about to stab him, Inez used her divine shield to block them, which surprised our protagonist. What he didn't know was that Inez had done it because she had concluded the best way to protect Lin at that moment was to keep him alive. Right after, she used some of the shields as swords to keep Zadu busy. In the meantime, she told our protagonist that they had to change their strategy if they wanted to win. From that moment onwards, she would focus on defense and asked him to take the newcomer out. In that instant, Nor had an idea, and after grabbing one of the frog's fangs, he told her that on his signal she would have to remove the shield that was in front of him. Shortly after, our protagonist's plan proved his worth because the fragments of the fangs managed to destroy the copies of Zadu's sword. Obviously, the former adventurer didn't want them to succeed and immediately thereafter tried to kill Inez with a surprise attack. But Nor managed to parry that one too, which left the newcomer startled, especially because his adamantite sword had broken in the process. Nor apologized again for breaking another of Zadu's weapons, and the other said again he didn't want an apology, although he asked our protagonist how he had been able to see his attacks and then used them to counter, but even Nor wasn't sure of how his ability works. Our protagonist then asked if the other was going to attack again, but Zadu said he wasn't. After all, it was a pain to recover Mithril after it got shattered all over the place. He then said he was going to leave and added that he had heard there was about to be a flashy celebration in the royal capital. Sadly, he didn't explain what he meant by that. Afterward, he tried one last surprise attack, but after Nor parried it, he finally gave up, saying our protagonist was exceptionally screwy, and that it was a shame to lose the good money he would have earned for taking Rollo back. Right after, he simply disappeared. Once he left, Nor began to discuss with the others the party that was going to be held in the royal capital. He even suggested they go back there, but at that moment Rollo fell to his knees and began to tremble. When Nor asked him what was happening to him, the kid asked them if they were from the royal capital, and after they confirmed it, he told them that they shouldn't go back because he had heard that the biggest monster had been sent there and that it was strong enough to wipe out the entire city. Nor didn't understand the kid's words, but Lin more or less realized something bad was about to happen there and asked them to go back. Unfortunately, Inez disagreed and tried to reveal what Rain had asked her, but the princess cut her off, saying she already knew. After all, she was his little sister and she knew how he thought. Nevertheless, she insisted on going back because they had to warn the others of the danger they were about to face. Not to mention that if they lost their homeland, they would surely suffer the same fate as the demon folks. In the end, Inez had to agree, but she asked the princess to not leave her side under any circumstances. Nor then asked Rollo what he wanted to do, and the kid said he was going to go with them. He knew that he could barely do anything, but he was sure that whoever was taking that monster to the royal capital should be one demon folk like him. Right after, Nor began to look at the horizon with a contemplative expression that Lin mistook for our protagonist being touched by Rollo's backstory. In truth, he was sad for not being able to taste the frog's meat. Right after, the quartet began their journey back to the royal capital, while Lin thought that it was her duty to take the legendary warrior, the one who had defeated the Black Death Dragon and was able to fight the legendary Deadman Zadu, back there as a reinforcement. Meanwhile, at the royal capital, Rain was walking through a devastated street when a knight informed him that just about all citizens in the old city had been evacuated. Moreover, the Sovereign Six had fended off the enemy's ambush. However, the prince said that there should still be another wave coming. The knight then added that the Secret Corps was conducting a desperate search for the enemy with no result. After hearing that, Rain replied that they would be attacking them at that moment because their forces were scattered. According to the prince, the enemy planned to exhaust them, so they should be setting up for the next big wave. The problem was that they couldn't see what that next wave would be. Suddenly, Rain had a hunch, and he began to see the sky and quickly noticed something weird in it. The prince then cast Uncover, and immediately thereafter a dragon of calamity was revealed. A flashback begins showing Nor's father explaining to a little Nor that there were some creatures called devil dragons which did mean things to people. He then told his son how an adventurer had slayed one of them by cutting its head off. Nor's father also explained how the scales, claws, fangs, and bones of those dragons could be turned into materials for high-quality weapons and medicines, which brought wealth to the land. That was the reason for that adventurer to become a hero who people called the Dragon Slayer. Of course, the kid quickly said that he wanted to become a Dragon Slayer too, but his father replied that it was not an easy task. Some dragons were incredibly strong ones that had lived for thousands of years. They could make the ground tremble just by walking, and even crumbled mountains by swinging their tails. In fact, that continent had almost been destroyed long before by dragons that had run wild. Back to the present, Nor was pulled out of his reverie by a strange sensation he was feeling. All the group was in the carriage, and despite they looked outside through the windows trying to see what was wrong, they couldn't find anything. However, just a few seconds later, they were finally able to see the Dragon of Calamity that was hovering outside the capital city walls. Meanwhile, the citizens of the capital were terrified while seeing the huge creature slowly flying above their heads. The dragon was so huge that its shadow covered an immense area of the city. Even Rain couldn't believe his eyes and asked if the Empire understood the horror they had unleashed. Right after, the knight beside him said that according to the records, it had been only 150 years since it had fallen asleep, so it should have been in its dormant period at that time. Immediately thereafter, the prince replied that those fools of the Empire had awakened it. In fact, he couldn't understand why they had used something so destructive in a simple dispute. At that moment, the dragon began to flap his wings, and the wind that action created was enough to damage the city badly. Rain then ordered the knight to round up everyone who had taken shelter in the capital and have them evacuate immediately. He even added that if they tried to stay, they had to carry them out. Not a single person should be left in the capital. Meanwhile, at the top of the city walls, Mayan of the Sovereign Six said that she was sensing more magic that was being used to obstruct all the evacuation routes, which meant it was basically impossible for the six of them to unite. After all, each one of them was busy fighting several monsters that had appeared at their locations. In the meantime, inside the castle, Gilbert told the king that they should leave and take refuge because they wouldn't stand a chance if the dragon got there. However, the monarch replied that he wanted the warriors to protect the people and focus on guiding them away from the capital. As for him, he still had his own job to take care of. Outside the city, Inez was using her binoculars to watch what was happening in the city, and afterward, she said that in the face of that dragon, there was no doubt the capital would be absolutely destroyed. She even guessed that they should be evacuating everyone at that moment. After hearing that, Lynn said that her father would surely choose to use himself as a shield despite knowing that even he was no match for something like that. In the end, she couldn't help but cry while begging that her father chose to leave instead. Nevertheless, Nor seemed to fail to understand yet the calamity the capital was facing and was amazed by the size of the dragon because it was the first time he saw one. Keep in mind that the previous one was seen by him as a frog. Our protagonist then asked Lynn if her brother and father were still in the city, and the princess confirmed it because she did not doubt that they had stayed behind, and to make things worse, it was too late for them to help them. Nevertheless, Nor disagreed with that and said that he thought he could do it if he ran. In fact, he added that they could use the same strategy they had applied against the Goblin Emperor. Lynn quickly understood what he meant. He wanted to use the wind blast to increase his speed. The princess was not sure of doing that because he would be hit pretty hard, but our protagonist reassured her, saying that his sword would take the brunt of it. Noor then added that he owed a lot to the people of that city and her dad, so he would like to lend a hand. After all, he thought that helping him escape shouldn't be too hard. After hearing those words, Lin reprimanded herself for being hesitant and thought that she couldn't judge her sensei as she would judge a normal person, so she should trust him and follow his lead. Back with the king, he was walking through a corridor inside the castle while recalling his conversation with the emperor when he threatened him with destroying his kingdom should he refuse to hand the Dungeon of the Lost over to the empire. That day, the emperor even went as far as to call him a coward for not using the resources of that dungeon to build a military power strong enough to control the world. Afterward, the dragon finally landed in the city, and the king said, while looking at the monster, that the emperor cared about nothing else as long as he got the dungeon. The monarch then admitted to himself that he had underestimated his enemy. After all, he had never expected he would throw the full force of his might at them like that. In the end, he had made a mistake in letting negotiations break down. The monarch then reached the roof of one of the castle towers and recalled her daughter when she was a little girl and ran happily in that place. The monarch then admitted he was not the best fit to be a king. He had always thought that he was more suited to being on the battlefield. Right after, he apologized to his subjects for following a foolish king like him and promised them that, although he was aware it wouldn't be enough to redeem himself from his sins, he was going to take one of the dragon's eyes with him. Back with our protagonist, Lin and Inez prepared a special setup to increase the power of Wind Blast, and shortly after they literally turned Noor into something very similar to a human bullet. After all, they had prepared a cannon-like magic device to condense and enhance the power of the spell. On the other hand, the king was ready to begin his fight against the dragon that had arrived at the castle after crushing a big part of the capital under its feet. However, before the monarch could make his move, the monster began to prepare its breath attack that surprised not only the king, but also his son and the soldiers that were nearby because they had recognized that attack as the one that had burned that continent to a crisp several hundred years before. In the end, the king smiled while thinking that the dragon wouldn't even give him the chance to retaliate. However, he decided to die with a flash and took out a special weapon while telling the dragon it was going to learn a painful lesson about how tenacious were the humans. Even the Sovereign Six had stopped what they were doing to witness the confrontation between their king and the dragon. Nevertheless, in the last moment, when both of them were about to clash, Noor arrived like lightning and parried the dragon's attack, astonishing all the witnesses. Afterward, the dragon began to wonder what had happened and tried to understand how a little person had been able to counter its attack. Obviously, that pissed the monster off big time, and it decided to crush the ant who had gotten on its way. Unfortunately, for the monster, its tail attack was also parried by Noor, although our protagonist was forced back too. Meanwhile, Inez, Rollo, and Lin finally arrived at the city. And after seeing the destruction the dragon had caused, they decided to find the king and escape that place as fast as possible. Sadly, some debris fell from the castle tower after being hit by the dragon's tail, and the trio was knocked down from their horses. To make things worse, a group of goblin emperors was heading towards them, although they were smaller than the one Lin had fought alongside our protagonist. The princess then recalled Noor's teachings and told Inez everything was fine because they were facing mere goblins. When the vice captain heard that, she smiled and replied that Lin was right. After all, compared to the dragon, those monsters were nothing. Sadly, the princess' attacks didn't cause damage, and the goblins managed to reach the place where the trio was. Only Inez's shield prevented them from attacking them. It was then that Rollo decided to use his powers to paralyze the monsters, allowing Lin and Inez to easily kill them. That made the princess realize how great was the power of demon folks. She even noticed it took Rollo great courage to use his ability. However, there was no time to waste, so she quickly told them they had to keep going. Back with Noor, the dragon couldn't believe its attack had been countered again. It made no sense to it, so it kept attacking our protagonist, who simply kept parrying those attacks. The worst part for the dragon was that its body was getting badly damaged despite supposedly being indestructible. As for our protagonist, he was amazed by his sword. Despite receiving all those huge impacts, it didn't have a scratch on it. The dragon then decided to change its strategy and took off while preparing another breath attack, thinking that time it wouldn't miss. Right after, the monster shot a powerful energy beam toward Nor. But contrary to everybody's expectation, our protagonist also managed to parry it. Immediately thereafter, the dragon roared and Rollo told Lin and Anise that the monster was angry. But not only that. The creature was frustrated because Nor wasn't treating it as a serious threat, even though that was what it was trying to be. As for the king, he said that dragons were prideful creatures, especially the one they were facing, which believed it was more powerful than anything. But watching that fight, it was almost like it had realized the man in front of it was stronger, which was true because, at that precise moment, the dragon had finally admitted the small one was itself. Nevertheless, the monster didn't surrender and attack again, only to be parried again, although it lost a claw in the process. Right after, the dragon fell at Nor's feet and the color of its eyes changed. After seeing that, Rollo said that the monster was submitting to our protagonist. Of course, that development left everyone flabbergasted, and that included Nor himself, who then recalled his father's words about that legendary hero who had gained the title of Dragon Slayer. However, after seeing the attitude of the dragon at that moment, he didn't find in him the will to kill it. He even admitted that perhaps he wasn't hero material. Immediately thereafter, Lin, Anise, and Rollo ran towards him, under the gaze of the king, while our protagonist greeted them with a big smile on his face. Lin asked Nor if he was okay, and he replied that he was fine. Then he finally understood what had happened and thanked Rollo for his help. Our protagonist had assumed the boy had calmed the dragon, but Rollo quickly said that he hadn't done anything. Nevertheless, Nor thought that Rollo didn't want others to know about his ability, and that was the reason he was saying he had nothing to do with the dragon's behavior. In the end, our protagonist didn't probe further, leaving another misunderstanding among them. Afterward, Nor asked Rollo if he could send the dragon back to where it had come from, but Anise disagreed with that decision because that dragon was very dangerous. Our protagonist then said that even though he understood that it was better to just kill it there if, at all possible, he didn't want to do it. Of course, Nor was aware that he was being selfish in asking for that, but he asked them to at least consider it. In the end, Lin agreed with his proposal and asked Rollo if he could do it. The kid was hesitant because the creature was very powerful, but Nor whispered to his ear that it was okay because neither Lin nor Anise were afraid of him. He then got closer to the dragon, and after a little while he told Nor that the dragon had said that it would do anything its master ordered, which surprised the others. However, our protagonist kept thinking that the dragon considered Rollo as its master. Nor then asked the kid to tell the dragon to quietly go back to where it had come from and to never harm humans again. After a while, Rollo said that the dragon had agreed with everything our protagonist had asked. Right after, the dragon took off and began to leave the city. Unfortunately, at that moment a magic beam hit it and the dragon ended up falling. Then, from a distance, the emperor watched everything with a big smile on her face while saying that everything couldn't have gone more perfectly. After all, even a dragon that had lived thousands of years was just a stupid beast in the end, nothing more than his pawn. Although he had thought that nothing would have been left of the capital at that point. Right after, he ordered his men to begin the attack. Afterward, one of the soldiers used a spell that revealed all the Empire's forces. There were thousands of soldiers heavy armed who were ready to initiate the conquest of the capital. At that moment, a flashback began showing how the Emperor discussed the plans with his officers. A well-known beast tamer had already awakened the Dragon of Calamity and had brought it to heel, which had paid off the high price they had demanded for doing it. Then, after the dragon went on a rampage, their forces would march on the royal capital. All foot soldiers would be equipped with magic swords and magic shields, while the elite troops would have magic armor and magic cannons. Furthermore, they would have 3 Aegises, the mobile mana bulwark generation device, and 4 of the ultra-high output mana ray weapon, the Brionac. Nevertheless, when the Emperor was celebrating his victory as if it had already happened, a knight called Randius interrupted him, and, after apologizing for being blunt, he said that he didn't see that war benefiting their country in the long run, so he begged him to reconsider. Unfortunately, the Emperor was pissed after hearing those words and mercilessly kicked the knight, saying he had heard enough and that no one could pose a threat to their empire while they stood at the top of magical technology. That was why they would use that war to make sure the world knew it. Back to the present, the Emperor said that soon, the story people would tell of the Clay's kingdom would be that it was a country of fools who neglected proper upkeep of the Dungeon of the Lost, and was led down to ruin by their own selfish greed. Meanwhile, the Empire would be remembered as a humanitarian army that liberated the people from their idiot of a monarch. After all, history did not need multiple storytellers. One truth was all that was needed. Back with our protagonist, he along with Nor, Inez, and Rollo arrived at the place where the dragon had fallen, but they didn't know if it was alive or not. That was why they wanted to get closer to find out. However, at that moment, Lin noticed the army of the magical empire, and that army also noticed them. The Emperor and one of his men quickly realized the princess and the divine shield were among the quartet, and the monarch even guessed that perhaps Inez was the reason why the royal capital had not been totally razed to the ground. After all, she was one of the living legends known all around the world. Nevertheless, the Emperor thought that it was just perfect to have found them because the era where legends ruled had already come to an end. They now lived in an era defined by those of them with wisdom. He then ordered his men to fire the Brionac on the quartet. The Emperor was confident in his strategy because he was sure that even though Inez was the divine shield, the heat of the Brionac would evaporate her into nothing. In the end, another of those so-called legends was about to die by his hand, which is why he loved going to war. Right after, he ordered to open fire, and almost immediately a magic beam, similar to the one that had taken down the dragon, was shot at Inez, who could only helplessly watch it going toward her. Luckily, Nor reacted on time and managed to parry the beam, astonishing everybody, including Rollo and Lin, who had previously gone away to take cover thanks to Inez's warning. In fact, the people of the Empire thought that there might have been a misfire due to a problem with the mana condensation process. Of course, the Emperor was pissed with the result and ordered to fire the Brionac again. As for our protagonist, he didn't know what was the nature of that attack, but was amazed by the size of the army of the Empire. Lin then explained that Doritas III had mobilized his troops. There were thousands or even 10,000 of them. Obviously, Nor didn't understand what was happening, and Inez told him that all they could say for sure was that those brutes were there to try and annihilate their kingdom. Lin then said that their army was not enough to put up a fight against those numbers, and the vice captain told her that they couldn't do anything else there, so they should retreat. The princess agreed and said they should meet up with her brother. She then asked our protagonist what he would do. Another misunderstanding arose at that point because he wanted to run away and Lin understood he was going to fight alongside them. But before they could say anything else, another round of magic beams was thrown toward them. Nevertheless, at that time Inez was prepared and blocked them with her divine shield. The Emperor found that development aggravating, and one of his men advised him to take shelter in the rear. The monarch then began to leave while ordering his men to finish the job quickly. Back with the quartet, Nor realized that they would keep them pinned there at that rate, so he decided to get their attention and buy Inez, Lin, and Rollo some time. He then asked them to take that chance to escape. Afterward, he thought that although he was bad at fighting, he was pretty used to running away and recalled when he had been forced to run away from some angry bees. Lin was hesitant, but in the end, agreed with his plan. At that moment, Rollo noticed that another Brionac was about to launch its attack, so the princess decided to use the same strategy they had utilized against the Goblin Emperor. Nor was against the idea, but before he could raise any objection, Ling used Wind Blast on him. Our protagonist then began to parry not only the magic beams thrown by the Brionax, but also all the attacks of the Imperial soldiers. The next second, countless swords and shields began to fly high in the sky, astonishing the Emperor and his officers, and before they could even react, Nor landed right behind them. At that moment, all the disarmed soldiers began to get injured by their own swords and shields once they started falling over them like a rain from hell. To the Emperor's despair, Nor didn't stop there and kept going back and forth parrying all the attacks from the Imperial army, causing more and more damage. Even the 3 Aegises ended up being destroyed in the process, and only the Brionax remained standing. Afterward, Nor appeared again behind the Emperor, who finally recognized him as one of the people who was beside Inez back then. However, the monarch couldn't understand how he had gotten right behind him that quickly. In that instant, our protagonist turned back and looked at him, which caused the Emperor to be afraid because he didn't understand why Nor's attention was focused on him. He even guessed that our protagonist knew he was the Emperor and had turned him into his target. Nevertheless, the monarch then recalled that he had his Kaiser armor and his Kaiser sword, which were both made of orichalcum, so he gained some confidence and decided to fight Nor. However, our protagonist just ignored him and went to destroy the Brionax. Immediately thereafter, the huge magic weapons were thrown into the sky and almost killed the Emperor because they landed very close to him. At that moment, desperation began to sink in the monarch's heart because he couldn't understand what was happening. He had 10,000 soldiers who were all perfectly equipped and magic weapons that could both withstand against dragon's breath and kill a dragon. However, all of that had ended up being useless against a single man. At that moment, Nor appeared in front of the Emperor, who was on the floor, and the monarch asked him who was he and why he hadn't killed him yet. It was then that the Emperor noticed the weapon Nor was holding. Right after, the monarch recalled the moment when he had seen it for the first time. That was the dungeon relic that he had wanted above all others, and he couldn't understand why the man in front of him had it. The Emperor also recalled that the sword had been made from an unknown metal, which was why it was supposed to be too heavy for any normal human to carry. He had even heard that King Clays, who was freakishly strong, needed both hands to use it. He couldn't accept there was a person who had surpassed that king, but that was the only way to explain what was happening. Hat Man had crushed the Imperial army by himself. That man alone had been the cause of his despair. The Emperor even theorized that the reason he was still alive was because our protagonist wanted him to endure the torture of humiliation before brutally beating him to death. In the end, he was doing to him exactly what he was planning to do to King Clays. The Emperor couldn't bear the torture anymore, and after pissing himself, he got up, mounted his horse, and began to run away like a madman, while thinking of Nor as the boogeyman. A flashback began, allowing us to see what had just happened while following our protagonist's path. In the end, Nor was not aiming to destroy the magic weapons of the Empire. He just was parrying, again and again, the swords and shields that were still falling to the ground to prevent the soldiers from getting their weapons back. The destruction of the Empire's gadgets was literally collateral damage. The ironic part was that while Nor was doing all that, he was concerned with the old man who was wearing flashy armor in the middle of the battlefield, thinking that he would get hurt. Little he knew that the old man was the Emperor, a vicious man who had been possessed by a huge fear at that moment after seeing our protagonist crushing his army. Back to the present, once the Emperor escaped, Nor finally felt the backlash of putting his body to the limit and began to cough blood while half kneeling on the ground. He didn't fall completely because he was using his sword, which he had previously stuck in the ground, as support. To make things worse, various terrified soldiers of the Empire's army were getting closer to Nor to kill him, while our protagonist began to lose consciousness, hoping Inez, Lin, and Roll had been able to safely escape. Luckily, Gilbert and his master arrived just in time to rescue him, while Nor became a fanboy after witnessing the power of the Sovereign of the Sword while killing the enemy soldiers. Meanwhile, the healer and the wizard of the Sovereign Six were complaining because Gilbert's master was killing the soldiers since they needed them alive to interrogate them. However, soon the healer got serious and warned the wizard that they should act quickly before another of the Sovereign Six arrived. So both of them joined hands to imprison the remaining enemy soldiers before healing them. Of course, after seeing all his former teachers in action, Nor doubled down in his fanboy state. After all, he couldn't believe he was seeing them again. Nevertheless, what he didn't know was that some of his former teachers also recognized him when they saw him, and shortly after they went to help him, along with Lin, Inez, and Rollo. Right after, a very concerned Lin quickly healed him, while Gilbert's teacher reported that a commanding officer had already confessed under Sane's interrogation that the Empire had not further troops. They had already thrown everything they had at them, including the dragon and beasts that had attacked the capital. Sadly, it seemed that the Emperor had escaped. That surprised the wizard because he couldn't believe that that decrepit old Foji had shown up on the battlefield. According to Gilbert's master, the Emperor should have been very confident in his resources to do that, to which the wizard replied saying that it had been a stupid move for a guy who demanded his people call him a wise ruler. In the end, the wizard believed the Emperor should be losing his marbles. After hearing that, Nor decided to intervene and told the others that he had seen the Emperor a little while before. He also added that the horse the ruler was riding had sparkly gold gear, which made him hard to miss. The wizard then guessed the Emperor was using orichalcum saddlery, which was very high-grade equipment that could support an extensive array of skills, which in turn explained how he had escaped so quickly. However, the wizard couldn't help but add that the ruler's fashion sense was as poor as his attitude. Nevertheless, Gilbert's master reminded them that if the Emperor managed to escape to the border, they wouldn't be able to go after him. There was a fortress as well as a bridge that spanned the ravine over there. Sadly, according to the wizard, there was no hope of catching up to him at that moment by normal means. Of course, everything would be different if there was a way for them all to fly. After hearing that, Nor had an idea and said that he thought it might be a way. Of course, assuming that the dragon was still alive. Shortly after, Nor, Lin, Rollo, Inez, Sane, and the wizard arrived at the place where the dragon had fallen, and almost immediately the wizard was excited since he was able to see a legendary creature that close. Even the healer was pleased because that was the first time he had been tasked with healing an enormous dragon. Sane then began to heal the dragon while telling Nor that he had grown quite a lot. It was at that moment that the wizard realized the man with them was his former student. After some greetings and teasing, the wizard asked Nor if he thought that riding the dragon was a good idea. After all, having them all ride on its back didn't seem safe to him. However, our protagonist reassured him saying that they had Rollo with them. The wizard then asked the kid if he was confident in his ability, and Rollo quickly replied he wasn't, which worried the wizard more. But Nor then intervened to support the kid. However, before our protagonist could say anything, the dragon woke up. Nor then told the kid to use his ability, and right after the dragon roared. That made our protagonist realize the creature was angry, and Rollo confirmed that by saying that not only the dragon wanted revenge, but it also wanted Nor to order it to get some. That surprised the wizard, who couldn't believe the kid had that much control over that dragon. Again, Nor gave all the credit to Rollo, and when the kid tried to clear the misunderstanding, the dragon roared again. Rollo then said that the dragon wanted to go right away. Nor then told them to get ready, and the first ones to step forward were Lin and Inez, which surprised our protagonist. Lin then explained that no one could talk to the dragon if Rollo didn't go, so Inez and her would guard him. She then asked Nor if he was going to go with them. Nor then began to sweat because he was afraid of heights, but he thought that it would be really awkward if he didn't tag along. After all, he had been the one who had come up with the idea and had dragged Rollo into that. So, he ended up saying he would go. Lin was pleased to hear that and said that Nor going with them was like having the strength of 100 people. Sane then said he was also going because he had the responsibility to look after his patient until it was fully recovered. The healer also added that they specialized in diplomacy, referring to Karu, the thief of the Sovereign Six, who had also arrived. Nor was happy to see another of his former teachers and asked him if he was also going with them, to which the other replied that if they were going to fly on that large beast, they would need the concealment skill. Oaken, the wizard, took that chance to say he was going with them too, but Sane reminded him that he needed to supervise the stone cage that he had used to imprison the Imperial soldiers. The wizard reluctantly agreed, and right after, Rain and his father arrived. The prince then told them that he wanted to go too since they would need a negotiator. Lin was very happy to see his father and older brother, and the king kind of apologized to her for having worried her. As for the vice captain, she kneeled in front of the prince saying she would accept any punishment for disobeying his order and returning to the capital. Nevertheless, Rain told her that it was his fault for giving such an idiotic order to her. In fact, he also told her that he was glad she had made it back. The group prepared to depart while the king reminded his son he was in charge and apologized to Nor for continuously asking for his help, before asking him to take care of the Lin and Inez. While the dragon took off, Dundarg asked Sig, Gilbert's master, if he was okay with letting Nor go without telling him something. After all, they had finally found him after all that time. Sig then replied that the fact of the matter was that he had never really needed them to play a role in his life. He also said that the idea that they could take him in and raise him was laughable. Dundarg agreed with that and said that our protagonist was like a hero straight out of the legends. In fact, he made him feel like a laughingstock. Sig then recalled the moment when he saw Nor's full power and how the sight of those swords, shields, and magic weapons in the air left him astonished. In fact, he was deeply ashamed of his own laziness and thought that he shouldn't have been wasting time thinking he was in any position to teach others. For that reason, he had decided to retrain himself from scratch since he had been made aware of his own shortcomings. After all, he couldn't rest on his laurels and let his sword rust. Dundarg seemed pleased after hearing that and told the other that for a guy who was deeply ashamed, he looked pretty happy. Gilbert's master quickly confirmed the other he was happy due to the spectacle Nor had shown them. After all, after being shown something like that, it was natural to be happy. Some time later, the dragon kept flying, but there were no signs of the Emperor, which made Rain think that perhaps the ruler might have already arrived back at the Empire. In fact, they were arriving at the border, and Karu said that they couldn't recklessly rush past it, so he advised them to consider going back. At that moment, Lin finally found the Emperor, but he was already crossing the bridge that signaled the border of the two countries. Karu also saw him and said that he was getting close to the Imperial capital's defenses on the other side of the bridge. He also added that they wouldn't make it back in one piece if they crossed into their territory. They were concealed at that moment, but once they were aware of their existence, the magic would lose its effectiveness. The prince heard the other's recommendation but replied that letting the Emperor escape was not an option. After all, they had access to powerful magical tools and could use them to greatly reinforce their military power, so they couldn't give them the time to do that. Lin knew his brother was right, but was a little bit afraid of what might be awaiting them. But Inez quickly intervened and asked permission from the prince to annihilate that entire area. If that was going to be their escape route later, it would be smart to annihilate their defenses while they had the chance. After hearing those words, the princess understood how angry the vice captain was. The royal capital she had vowed to risk her life to protect had been trampled on. Right after, the prince not only permitted her to do it, but he also told her to not hold back. Immediately thereafter, Inez used her full power to destroy the Imperial defenses at the border, securing their escape route. Then, Rain told her sister that their actions there would determine the course of the war. They were going to keep pursuing the Emperor even if that took them to the capital, so he asked her if she was ready for that. to which she immediately replied that she was. She had a strong confidence in the power of all the people who were with her, especially her teacher. What she didn't know was that Noor, who looked very calm from afar, had actually passed out. The emperor finally entered the imperial capital, which was a cyberpunk-styled city. Once inside, he took one of the elevators, saying that the whole situation was infuriating and vexing. Afterward, he arrived at the throne room, and all his officers showed their worries after seeing him in that deplorable state. However, the emperor replied by showing his rage and complaining about his soldiers because he had given them high-caliber weaponry and their performance had been lackluster at best. After hearing those words, his officers began to ask what had happened, but before the emperor could reply, they all noticed that the Dragon of Calamity was almost above the city, which astonished the monarch because he was sure that the Brionac had killed it. The first thought of the emperor was that the dragon had been resurrected somehow, which led him to think that the diabolical man, known as Sane of the Sovereign Six, had reached a new high with his healing magic. However, that alone didn't explain how they had managed to make the dragon follow their bidding, so the monarch assumed they had some demon folk helping them. Immediately afterward, he demanded his officers to tell him where was the beast tamer, and one of them replied that Master Lude had already left for Serenza. It seemed there was urgent business that required his attention. Of course, that confirmed the emperor's suspicions that the beast tamer had changed sides. He then grabbed that officer who had previously replied by the collar and rose him from the floor while asking him why they hadn't stopped Lude. To which the officer replied that the monarch himself had told them to give special treatment to the beast tamer. The emperor threw the man to the ground and another officer asked him to calm down, but the monarch replied by demanding him to stop standing around like an idiot and come up with a plan to fix that mess, causing the other to leave the hall after agreeing. Afterward, he demanded the rest of the officers to get the Karanos ready, which left them startled. Right after, the officer who had explained the beast tamer situation replied that the weapon was still in the testing stage. The power output remained too high, and the sights hadn't finished being properly aligned. Not to mention it was dangerous to use it in the city. Nevertheless, the monarch replied by reminding them of the disaster that was right in front of their eyes. Even though the officer tried to explain that the possibility of collateral damage was very high, but the emperor cut him off by kicking him away. Right after, he commanded them to do it. After all, they only needed one shot to kill the beast. That time, the officers complied. Almost immediately, the Karanos, a huge cannon that was part of the city, began to charge, while the monarch said that it was the greatest technological in the empire, developed under the wise leadership of Doritas III. The Light of Judgment. Unfortunately, for the Empire, Noor managed to parry the cannon's attack, leaving the Emperor and his officers flabbergasted because they didn't understand why the trajectory of the attack had changed. And what was worse, the energy beam had spread and had begun to rain down on them. In fact, the new target of that ray was their mana furnaces. To make things even worse, all of his officers decided to leave the command center since they were sure that the city was about to be destroyed, and thus they decided to flee. Right after, the beams destroyed the mana furnaces, making the Emperor fall on his knees out of despair. A few seconds before the cannon launched the attack, our protagonist and his group began descending in the city, while Karu informed them that he had lost track of the Emperor. Apparently, there was a thick wall preventing him from pinpointing his location, which made Rain suspect that the monarch had taken refuge in a building made of mana metal. It was then that the cannon fired and Noor woke up almost at the same time. Our protagonist then moved by reflex and parried the beam, surprising everybody. Sadly, due to the impact, he ended up falling off the dragon. However, he used his sword as a shield to destroy the walls and have a safe landing. Meanwhile, the officer who had previously asked the Emperor to calm down, who looked more like a knight than an officer, returned with other knights, but rather than help the monarch, they had gone there to kill him since there was no one there willing to obey him. Not to mention that they were doing that trying to fix the mess the Emperor had created. Nevertheless, when the knight was about to kill the monarch, Nor landed there and stopped him. Although, when the old man saw our protagonist, rather than feeling grateful, he felt terrified. To make things worse, the knights interpreted Nor's actions as if he was protecting the emperor, so they began to attack him, forcing our protagonist to defend himself. Nor tried to talk some sense into the knights while preventing them from killing the monarch, but the knights didn't listen to him. Not to mention that in order to protect the monarch, our protagonist was giving him an ultimate beating since that was the fastest way to move him around. Luckily, after a while, the knights managed to explain Nor their intentions. They wanted to offer the emperor's head to the invaders to show them their will to surrender. Right after, Sane and the others arrived and said there was no need for that. After all, dead men couldn't atone for their crimes. Afterward, Nor left the hall with Lin and let Rain and the others handle the rest. Once they left, Rain said he wanted to talk to the emperor, who was on the verge of tears at that moment. In fact, the monarch began to beg for forgiveness. However, Rain replied by telling him all the crimes he had committed and adding that he was willing to forgive him if he was willing to experience the same amount of suffering the victims of the empire's attack had suffered. Afterward, the prince said that he would like to hold a multinational talk about reparations and ending the war, which was approved by the Circuit of 10, the knights from before. The emperor then asked what Rain meant by experiencing the same suffering, and Sane replied that the monarch would experience their whole pain without dying. After all, he was a healer and the emperor had to participate in the multinational talk. On the other hand, Karu reassured him, saying that even if the emperor lost consciousness during the process, they would bring him back, so the monarch could feel free to cry and scream as much as he liked, which made the old man piss himself. Outside the hall, Rollo was sleeping alongside the dragon while Lin healed Nor's wounds. Right after, he saw the destruction caused by the beams and felt bad about it, thinking that he might have killed some people. But the princess reassured him, saying that the buildings destroyed were mana furnaces, although that would affect the lives of the people in the imperial capital. Some time later, Rain and the others arrived and told Lin and Nor that everything had been settled, which confused our protagonist because, considering how fast things had been solved, he didn't understand why both nations hadn't talked it out from the beginning. As for the emperor, he had abdicated and his grandchild would be chosen to inherit the throne. Right after, the Circuit of 10 arrived and apologized to Nor for the misunderstanding. But our protagonist said it was okay, although he advised them to reconsider their morals if they thought it was okay to gang up on the elderly like that. The leader of the knights then thanked Nor for having stopped them, otherwise their empire would have ended up in a very nasty civil war. So they told our protagonist that in the future they would spare no expense to assist him. After hearing that, Nor apologized for the destruction he had caused. But Imperial Sorcerer Randius, the leader of the Circuit of 10 and the man the Emperor had ordered to fix that mess, said that he shouldn't worry about it because up to that moment, there were no reports of dead or injured. Not to mention that the crimes committed by the Empire had been far more serious. Afterward, Nor and the others left, and some time later they safely returned to their country and reported to the king what had happened during their mission. Right after, both the king and the prince thanked Nor for his incredible contributions on the battlefield. However, our protagonist said he didn't want to be rewarded because he did not need anything, which surprised everybody. Nevertheless, the king said Nor couldn't reject the reward because that would set a bad example. Our protagonist then said that he would like the king to help Rollo out because he didn't have anyone to live with. The monarch asked if the kid was a demonfolk, and Nor quickly confirmed it before asking the king to allow Rollo to live in the capital while providing him with a normal life, just like all other citizens. Nor also added that since they had previously offered him a house and land before, they could give those to the kid plus some clothes and food. After hearing the request, the king agreed but said that for that to happen, the boy would need to become a citizen of that kingdom. So the monarch asked Nor if he was okay with that. Our protagonist then replied that the kid had saved him countless times. not to mention that the only reason that huge dragon had followed his will was because the kid was with him. At that point, Rollo tried to clarify the situation, but Nor cut him off and added that if not for Rollo, the war wouldn't have ended that quickly. The king then thought that Nor's request was problematic since the holy theocracy of Mithra regarded the demonfolks as enemies, which meant that accepting one in their kingdom would cause a rift in the relationships between both countries. Nevertheless, before the monarch could say anything, Nor added that he didn't need anything else, so any reward should be redirected to those who had lost their homes. He even said that the kingdom should be focusing all its resources on that, which surprised everybody again. In the end, the king agreed to Nor's request. Some time later, Rollo was sleeping and recalled what he had thought when he believed he was going to die. The kid woke up right after and found herself in an unknown room. Shortly after, he was in the dining room and Inez informed him that from that moment onwards he was going to live with her. She then noticed that the kid was lost in his thoughts while looking at the food and pulled him out of his reverie, saying that the food would get cold if he didn't hurry and eat. The kid then began to eat and couldn't stop himself from crying while doing so, since he still couldn't believe he was eating something so delicious. Of course, that touched the vice captain, who told him that no one would take the food from him. The people were working hard rebuilding the capital, while Nor walked through it thinking that the destruction had been indeed awful, and wondering if Auntie Stella and the guys at the construction site were okay. Shortly after, he arrived in front of the guild headquarters and was happy to confirm that they had made it through somehow. Right after, he noticed that the signboard was on the floor and quickly grabbed it, thinking it had been a while since he had looked at it. A flashback then began, and we could see a younger guildmaster being shocked after learning that our protagonist had spent a full 3-month term practicing at every training school, without being able to get a single decent skill. In the end, Nor left the place after the guildmaster told him that he couldn't let him register as an adventurer like that. Back to the present, Nor thought it had been unbelievable that he had reunited with his former instructors. After all, the last time he had seen them had been 15 years before. Another flashback began, and we could see how was Clay's royal capital 15 years before. There we could see a younger version of Nor asking Sig to train him as a swordsman, to which the member of the Sovereign Six replied by asking the young man if he had a permit from the Adventurers Guild. Nor didn't waste time and showed the permit, and Sig warned him that the training would be very tough before asking him if he was prepared to bear with it. The training began, and after the first day, Sig predicted that our protagonist wouldn't last more than 3 days. However, 10 days later, the member of the Sovereign Six had to admit that, at the very least, the tenacity of that kid was definitely nothing to scoff at. Later, Nor managed to parry a huge iron ball with a wooden sword, but he injured his arm and dropped the sword, earning a scolding from Sig. Nor then gritted his teeth and grabbed the sword, surprising Sig because the instructor couldn't believe that our protagonist's eyes were still so full of vigor after getting his body and mind put through the ringer. It was then that Sig thought that that kid might have a promising future. Later, Nor asked him when he would get a skill and what kind of skill he would get. The instructor complied and showed him a powerful skill capable of cutting several leaves by using several moves at a very high speed, leaving our protagonist amazed. Nevertheless, in the end, the one who was shocked was Sig, because not only Nor had managed to see the technique, but he even managed to replicate all the movements, although he wasn't able to move that fast. The instructor then confirmed that with Nor's latent potential, if nurtured properly, he could match or even surpass him. However, 2 months later, Sig couldn't believe that the only skill Nor had managed to learn had been parry. It was frustrating because our protagonist only needed to learn one useful skill. 1 month later, the training ended and Nor wasn't capable of learning another skill. Afterward, Nor began to train with Dundarg, and again, he was warned since that training was also tough. Shortly after, the new instructor explained that the role of a warrior was to become the shield for his allies. 2 months later, Dundarg had to admit that the fact of Noor having gotten that far had truly surprised him. Not to mention that he was tough and gutsy, he just needed to learn one useful skill for the instructor to turn him into an invincible shield. 1 month later, the training ended, and it was the same story. He couldn't learn a useful skill. Some time later, he asked Mayan to let him join her training camp, and she prepared an impossible test for him, so he failed, giving her a reason to refuse, but Noor managed to hit the mark every single time despite the distance, which left her with no choice but accepting him. However, despite accepting him, she still refused to teach him properly and only allowed him to throw stones against the targets while thinking that teaching him properly would be troublesome. Eventually, she gave in and let him use a bow. But that was when the problem started because he was too strong and kept crushing every bow he touched, even the instructor's bow. 3 months later, the training camp ended and Mayan didn't waste time before telling Noor to leave despite he hadn't learned a useful skill. Although, in the end, she admitted that even without a bow, our protagonist had already gotten enough to hack it. The next stop was Karua's camp, and, unlike the previous instructors, he accepted Noor without hesitation. Nevertheless, although he was capable of passing all the tests during the training, he didn't do it in the spy's way, but in a complete head-on way, which missed the point of those tests. 3 months later, despite Karu acknowledging our protagonist's strength, he had to tell him to go since he couldn't follow the way of the spy. In fact, he even considered extending him an invitation to join the royal capital's intelligence agency in case Noor gave up becoming an adventurer. Afterward, it was Oken's turn, and 2 months after the training camp started, Noor still struggled to use magic, which led the instructor to think that there was no mana flowing through Noor's body in the first place. In the end, the only hope of changing that was for our protagonist to go inside the mana resonance room. Taking that into consideration, Oken let him go inside, but the instructor warned our protagonist, saying that he should leave immediately if it started feeling too intense. Some time later, Oken was informed that Noor hadn't come out yet, and the instructor freaked out because that room drastically amplified all of the human senses. So the thought of one person remaining inside for various days was simply outrageous because that person could end up dead. As for Noor, he was being one with the universe, which astonished Oken, especially when our protagonist told him that he was okay and that there was nothing wrong with his body. Noor even told the instructor to leave him alone because he was close to having a breakthrough, before sending Oken out of the room. Sadly, 1 month later, Noor told Oken that he had only managed to learn one spell before creating a small fireball on the tip of his finger. The instructor then told him that it was amazing that he had only managed to learn that spell. After all, it was rare to see people as incapable of magic as he was. Although the instructor also admitted that given our protagonist's lack of mana, it was actually impressive how far he had gone. Especially when he saw Noor casting another tiny fireball with his other hand. In the end, our protagonist was a dual caster, which astonished Oken. After all, the instructor had to spend 50 years to get to that point. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough for Noor to become an adventurer, and that depressed our protagonist a lot. In fact, Oken thought it was a pity because he knew that the kid had so much talent. If only his body was more attuned to magic, he could have been known through the land as an unparalleled magician. Finally, it was Sane's turn, and the priest asked Noor if he had undergone the rite of blessing when he was a small child, but our protagonist had no idea of that rite. The instructor then told him that only students who had been selected in advance and undergone that rite could train at that school. Nevertheless, our protagonist wasn't willing to take no for an answer, and replied that he was not leaving until Sane agreed to let him train there. Even though the priest didn't agree, various days passed and Noor was still outside the temple despite the low temperatures due to the snow that was falling. Eventually, Noor couldn't take the hunger and the cold anymore and was about to pass out. But Sane arrived in time and, after healing him, he told our protagonist that he would allow him to participate in the basics of their training. But there was no guarantee that he would actually learn a skill. 3 months later, Noor managed to learn low heel, which impressed Sane, but sadly that skill wouldn't be recognized as a serviceable one to become an adventurer. Our protagonist was disappointed again and decided to leave. But while he was leaving, Sane told him that even though that skill only worked on scratches, it was impressive that he could use low-level healing magic without a natural blessing. The priest was aware that Noor had performed a miracle on his own without undergoing the rite or using a Holy Spirit as an intermediary. So, that meant he could wield the power of miracles without limit. The next day, the Sovereign Six had a meeting where they discussed Noor's case. However, our protagonist had already disappeared from the capital. Sane then lamented not having stopped him the day before, while Mayan said that they could let the kid be since he was strong enough to hack it on his own. Nevertheless, Sane disagreed with that decision because he knew that if they invested their time in nurturing our protagonist's gifts, then that boy would undoubtedly become someone extraordinary. After hearing that, Oaken immediately agreed. Afterward, Dundarg said that he had never imagined that Noor had been going through the same thing at all the other schools, and Sane reaffirmed his proposal of training our protagonist and guiding him. In the end, they all agreed, and immediately thereafter Sig headed off on a journey to find Noor. Well, he tried because the other 5 Sovereign didn't allow it. After all, since they had agreed to train him as a group, they were going to look for him as a group too. Back to the present. Noor entered the Adventurers Guild and gave the signboard to the Guildmaster, who asked him why he hadn't gone to Mithra. Our protagonist then told him that after seeing the state of the city, he had turned around and rushed back. They both then talked about how tough things were at that moment, and after a while the Guildmaster informed our protagonist that the construction guild boss had been searching high and low for Noor. He needed him to haul away some rubble and help build temporary housing and the like. That night, Noor was still helping the workers of the construction guild, who were really glad to have him helping them. As for our protagonist, he couldn't help but think of all the things that had happened during that day, from traveling in a carriage up to subduing an empire, while defeating 2 dragons and meeting Rollo in the process. In the meantime, the king was telling Rain that the holy theocracy of Mithra had been working behind the scenes with Doritas on the war, to which the prince replied that looking forward it seemed their days wouldn't be peaceful. Nevertheless, the king said that there were capable people their nation could depend on, such as Gilbert, Enise, Rollo, Lynn, the Sovereign Six, and of course, Noor. Speaking of our protagonist, he was feeling very hungry since he had worked all night, but luckily the princess gave him a piece of bread so he could eat and keep going. Right after, while he was eating it, he couldn't help but think that he really wouldn't be where he was without everybody's help. Although he still hadn't given up on his dream of becoming an adventurer. At that moment, the construction boss asks him for help moving some rubble, but Noor notices that the building next to him is collapsing. Then, Noor activates his parry ability and deflects a piece of the tower, saving his bald boss. This was the final episode of this anime. Watch this next video on screen and subscribe to not miss more anime recaps.